I would like to welcome all of you, but first and foremost, of course, I would like to welcome our speaker, Biko Agozino. He is the Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at Virginia Tech, and we are really happy to be inviting him back, I think, to Scotland would be the right thing to say today, because his education started at the universities of Calabar and Cambridge, but then he came to what was then the Centre for Criminology and the Social and Philosophical Study of Law in Edinburgh. And I think his scholarship, his writing really emphasizes every part of the title of that centre: criminology, social studies, philosophical approaches. He is an academic with an extensive range of articles, chapters, reviews, 11 books that he has authored or edited, whether solo or in collaboration. And his scholarship covers theory, methods, substantive empirical research, disciplinary critique, and it's that really, I think, that really our focus is on today, and it provides the theme for today, as is exemplified by his development of a counter-colonial criminology. This is something that's been evident in his work going back to his PhD in the mid-1990s, a study of the victimization of Black women in the criminal justice system, and that's something that really questions our use of the term punishment in criminology. It launches a critique of criminologies that are more oriented to supporting effective methods of control rather than looking at problems of marginalization. And it takes really seriously the intersection of oppressive race, class, gender relations. It's a theme that continues in his major work, Counter-Colonial Criminology, the Critique of Imperial Reason, which takes the discipline of criminology and exposes its links to imperial projects. And as this is the last seminar before Christmas, I think I'm allowed to paraphrase Scrooge to say that it may be that there's more of the empire than the empirical in our discipline. I mean, I think his work is important as much for exposing those links as it is for drawing out the theoretical implications of neglecting colonialism when we do our criminological scholarship. And then finally, just to highlight one more of his papers before I hand over, I think it's there again in one of his many contributions to the African Journal of Criminology and Justice Studies, where he picks up the lack of purchase that criminology has in a number of formerly colonized countries, noting that this control freak discipline is very much tainted by its history and service of empire. That's a kind of flying tour of only some of his many works. And I think it's best now that I hand over to Biko, who will talk for somewhere in the region of 30 minutes, and then we'll have a chance for discussion. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Andy. I think you finished my talk, and I can just sit down now and take questions. But this is a pleasure for me to be invited back to Edinburgh. Edinburgh feels like the home city for me in the UK. Maybe because that's where my formative years lie. So today I'd like to present this "we" seminar. That's the only Scottish word I still remember. And move my focus slightly away from the critique of imperialist reason to the critique of neo-colonial reason, because of the paradox that even after political independence, or in the case of Scotland, after political devolution, a lot of the colonial policies imposed continue to be retained by the colonized, even after some of the colonizers have allowed those policies to wither away. So that's a discussion that I started with my doctoral dissertation at Edinburgh, which was a continuation of my master's essay at Cambridge on Black women and the criminal justice system, as Andy said. So bear with me, there's a lot in the slide presentation, but I'm just gonna try to summarize it, and then we can take questions and expand on them in a while. It's only one slide, but since you are familiar with my work, I don't have to go into too much details. So I'd like to say thank you again to the University of Edinburgh for awarding me the scholarship to come to Edinburgh for my doctorate, and to Cambridge for also giving me a scholarship to go to Cambridge. I'm very appreciative of those opportunities. My work on Black women and the criminal justice system was indeed inspired by my activism in Nigeria within an organization that was known as Women in Nigeria, an organization that campaigned for women's rights as human rights. And it was in that context of activism that I learned about the high rates of arrest and incarceration of Nigerian women as drug mules in UK prisons. And so that was why I decided to write or research that area, because at that time there was no book or major article on Black women and the criminal justice system. But a colleague who reviewed the book, Professor Onwudiwe, was the first to inform me that you are developing a decolonization paradigm, a new paradigm in criminology. And he was right, because in that book, I talked about the work of Proctor on internal colonialism in the British Isles, but he didn't actually go beyond talking about internal colonialism to talk about decolonization. I also talked about Habermas, who was probably introduced to me in this area by Ian Loder, who was doing his doctoral research on the theory of communicative action and had presented at seminars in Edinburgh. And I found Habermas' emphasis on the colonization of the life world by economic power as very instructive. But again, Habermas did not go beyond talking about the colonization of the life world to also talk about the decolonization of the life world from economic power. And then at Cambridge, I met Tony Bottoms, whose theory of bifurcation is influential in criminology. The idea that the law does not only punish and repress, but also cares through welfare for the people. So there are two prongs in criminal justice system, care and punishment. And he said that that's actually what Foucault was referring to with the title of his book, Discipline and Punish. But I think there is a third finger there, maybe the middle finger of the devil's fork, which is also the triptych that Britannia holds in illustrations of Rule Britannia. It has three prongs on that fork. One is maybe welfarism, another one is punitiveness, but there is that other one that I call victimization of the innocent by the criminal justice system. So that's what I try to develop. And if there is that victimization that arises from the colonization or attempts to colonize other processes in the criminal justice system as if they were part of the penal empire, then I started calling for the decolonization of those victimization practices from the empire of punishment, so that we can treat victimization not as part of punishment, but as a crime against humanity that can be responded to with maybe reparative justice. So Onwudiwe was perceptive in identifying that contribution, and I have taken it further to counter-colonial criminology by visiting the work of Edward Said on culture and imperialism, where he took Habermas to task and took Foucault to task, because Habermas is talking about the institutional colonization of the life world by the economic power, but Habermas doesn't talk about actually existing systems of colonization. According to Said and the supporters of Habermas would say Habermas was not talking about the history of the whole world. He was only talking about the history of Western Europe in his work. And Said said, well, you can't talk about the history of Western Europe without talking about the colonized and the colonizers that made Europe what Europe became. Similar critique was leveled at Foucault by Said, because Foucault talked about power, the microphysics of power, etc., but did not actually talk about actually existing colonial systems of power and the struggles to decolonize that system of power through decolonization struggles, through the struggles to regain independence. Again, Foucault would say, but I'm not talking about the history of the whole world with a capital H. I'm only talking about the history of Western Europe. Well, Monsieur, le Professor Foucault, you can't talk about the history of Western Europe without talking about European colonization of the rest of the world. Answered, it was Said. Said would say that the work of Frantz Fanon is actually more instructive in understanding attempts to recolonize the world and resistance to recolonization around the world, rather than Foucault or Habermas. But reading Habermas further, I found actually that Habermas did talk about Africa in the theory of communicative action, but he talked about African communication practices as being pre-civilizational, or in his word, pre-literate. And both of those descriptions of African communication or language is really pejorative, if not racist, on the part of Habermas, a big error in his theory. Anyway, I've also been influenced or guided by the work of Paul Gilroy, the classic essay in the Socialist Register on the myths of Black crime, which was a critique of left realism that presumed that there is a culture of criminality among Black youth and joined tabloid newspapers to call on Black leaders to rein in the activities, illegal activities of Black youth. And Gilroy was arguing in that very influential paper that there is no such thing as Black crime. It's only a myth. Just like there is no such thing as white crime. It would be a myth to talk about it that way. So I've been influenced by those things. And while I was a student in Cambridge, Maureen Kane came to give a seminar, so I was introduced to her work on standpoint feminism. And while I was at Edinburgh, although I was already familiar with Carol Smart, she also came to talk about false standards in methodology. When we compare women with men, the practice is usually to regard the men as the standards for which, against which women will be compared. And she said that was a false standard. Alison Young at Cambridge University also co-edited that book, influential book, with Lorraine Gelstop while I was at Edinburgh, at Cambridge. And it was influential to me. And I thank Alison Young especially for recommending me to the criminology program at Edinburgh. Right. Other texts that have influenced me include Davis, Angela Davis, Women, Race, and Class, as issues that should not be treated as independent variables because they are interconnected, or in the word of Stewart Hall, they are articulated rather than separate. In America, they call that intersectionality, race, class, gender intersectionality. Bell Hooks' work was also influential in developing counter-colonial criminology, where she talks about feminist theory from margin to center and calls for democratic parenting, even in families, so that we can pursue decolonization beyond international relations to address power relations at the interpersonal level. Collins' Black feminist thought was also influential to me as a text, a theoretical guide in developing my own thinking. So the question today for us to ponder is perhaps to begin with the puzzle that the people of Scotland have had two opportunities to vote on independence, and in both cases, they've voted no. That will be surprising to me as an African, because I don't think there was any country in Africa that regained independence through a referendum. But it would even be more surprising if there was a referendum and the referendum failed. So what is it about neo-colonialism that makes people in neo-colonies to, well, even prefer or yearn for the colonial relationship to continue? There are still Africans who say maybe Africans regained their independence too early and that they should have remained colonized maybe longer so as to develop further. So maybe you guys in Scotland would explain that no vote in the referendum. We used to joke when I was a student in Scotland that you Scottish people should consult us. You should make us consultants in your struggle to regain independence, because we went through decolonization first. And if you ask us, we say, you don't do it through a referendum. You just declare your independence. That's what we did in Africa. But maybe Africa is not a good model for Scotland, because we continue to struggle with neo-colonialism, as Kwame Nkrumah put it. He said that neo-colonialism is the last stage of imperialism, and our advancement on the theory of Lenin that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. And so Nkrumah said then neo-colonialism is the last stage of imperialism. I summarized a quote from Nkrumah as the epigraph for Counter-Colonial Criminology, replacing imperialism with criminology, and it seemed to go very well. At Edinburgh, I was introduced to the theory of the withering away of the state, the withering away of law by David Garland, because he summarizes theory in his book, Punishment and Modern Society by Pashukanis. The theory of withering away of state was, of course, developed by Lenin, following Marx, but more popularized by Pashukanis. And it was a puzzle to me as to why, after decolonization, the former colonized countries did not allow the colonial laws to wither away. Rather, they retained those colonial laws, even when the colonizers were allowing some of them to wither away in the metropole. And my supervisor at Edinburgh, Peter Young, also encouraged my thinking along these lines by saying that utopia has a place in criminological theory. We shouldn't reject utopia out of hand. So even if what I'm thinking today or writing in my work can be described as utopian, there's nothing wrong with it, according to Peter Young. So I benefited from such encouragement. Neil McCormick was a professor of philosophy of law, jurisprudence, and he had this generous habit of inviting students and staff to a party in his house. And we talked informally about the struggle for Scottish independence. And we joked that he should be using us as consultants because we can maybe make a contribution. And Beverly Brown was also influential to me because she organized a reading group. We met every Thursday to read things that I would never have bothered to read, things like Nietzsche, the Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and other texts that helped me to develop my critical thinking. She also invited us to her home and showed off her North African swords that she put on her wall. Interesting. And Bankowski, also in jurisprudence, was influential following his contributions to seminars, but also his inaugural essay on law and love has been fascinating for me. So that is the advantage I gained from going to Edinburgh rather than any other university, because that concentration of theoretical orientations and philosophical orientations and policy, obviously, influenced my work a lot. In terms of the reception of counter-colonial criminology, I must be very grateful to my colleagues who have seen value in that work. Sean Gabidon, a distinguished professor at Penn State University, devoted pages, almost a chapter to review, a rave review, I would say, of counter-colonial criminology in his book, Perspectives on Race in Criminology, in Crime and Justice. Oriola, a professor in Canada, also highlighted my work by writing a review essay that said that that work is introducing what he called post-colonial criminology. And Cape Hart did a very good review and critique at SUNY Albany, State University of New York, Albany, where she questioned my assumption that imperialism is the general character of criminality. And I said that in that book, I concluded that what rapists, pickpockets, kidnappers, corrupt officials have in common is that they try to invade your space, to colonize it, and therefore we should regard imperialism as the general character of all crimes. That is suggesting that imperialism is also a crime. And she said that maybe I will be belittling the impact or seriousness of imperialism if I compared that with pickpockets. And she has a point there. I'm not comparing the seriousness of those crimes with one another. I'm only comparing their will to power, their will to colonize the spaces of others. Maureen Kane was perhaps the most influential reviewer of the book in the Howard Journal, where she really did a very good review for me. And but she said in her review that the book is an angry book. I've never seen an angry book. I don't think it was intended to be angry. But another colleague also who supports my work, who has reviewed it favorably, told me that some of his white students are unnerved by the book. And I told him, well, they must have had a nerve to begin with. That was a joke. And above all, Joe Figgin, in his book, Liberation Sociology, identified the work that I do as being an example of what he calls liberation sociology, or what we can call liberation criminology. At the time the book was published, the African Journal of Criminology and Justice Studies, of which I am the editor-in-chief since 2005, decided to publish a special panel of reviews, I think 5 reviews of the book, all rave reviews. Okay, so I'm the editor-in-chief and therefore I might be biased, but they didn't have to praise my book. They could have knocked it, but they were all rave reviews. And that panel came from an American Society of Criminology roundtable that actually reviewed the book also. So I'm really grateful to my colleagues for their support and for the prominence they are giving to my work around the world. That might be the reason why a website that is called Academic Influence recently included my name among top influential criminologists, using citations of my work, but also anonymous reviews of my work on Wikipedia. I'm really grateful to all of you for your support of the modest contributions that I have made. But having said that, Africans and the former colonized people tend to retain colonial laws, I must give credit to African women who are continuing the struggle to regain independence in different areas. And their work has been influential, in my view, in developing my own thinking. Top among them is Ifya Madume at Dartmouth College, whose book, Female Husbands, Male Daughters and Female Husbands, indicated that colonialism did not succeed in wiping away African cultural traditions, because in Africa, before we were colonized, a woman who was barren was allowed to marry another woman. She would be the female husband, that is female guys, husband. Or a daughter whose father didn't have a son would decide to stay home and become the male daughter and have children with other men, but in her father's name. Okay, so that is still privileging maleness, if you like, but the practice is still existing in Africa, which is the point that she was making. Oyeronke Oyewumi also wrote The Invention of Women as Inferior by Europeans under the principle of primogeniture, that suggested that even a one-day-old born son had more value than older women. And she said that that doesn't apply to African cultures, because in Africa, gender is not the primary consideration in interpersonal or intergroup relations. According to her, generation is more important in Africa than gender, because whether you're male or female, younger people would lie down on the ground to greet you among the Yoruba, because they respect generation more than gender. And Nkiru Nzegu at State University of New York in Binghamton has the book Family Matters, where she interrogates Simone de Beauvoir on her claim that women are always the second sex because men are used as the primary standards. And she disagreed with that and said that in African cultures, women have had more rights than you would imagine if you accept Simone de Beauvoir's thesis. She actually illustrated it with the case of a woman who was being driven out from her house after her husband died by her husband's brothers because she didn't have a son. And she successfully argued that in African culture, a woman who has daughters is allowed to live in that house that she built with her husband, with her daughters, and the daughters are allowed to inherit their father's house. It is a colonialist idea that only men can inherit property. That law or practice was outlawed by the Nigerian Supreme Court only in 2018, when they ruled that daughters have every right to inherit property equally with sons. And the African Union Commission appears to be pursuing this by requiring that the African Union Parliament should have 50% male and 50% female representation. They call it the principle of parity. And some African countries are adopting that in their constitution. So there is a continuing struggle to advance decolonization and resist recolonization in some aspects. In settler colonial locations in Australia and New Zealand, in North America, my work has also been really supported by colleagues to whom I am very thankful. The Forum for Indigenous Research Excellence at Macquarie University in Australia has appointed me as a member of their forum. And my colleague, Juan Tauri in New Zealand, and Chris Coonin in Australia have written a very influential book on indigenous criminology, in which they highlighted my work as being a useful guide for theirs too. Tauri and Angie Descartes have also celebrated the 10th anniversary of my Counter-Colonial Criminology by publishing, guest editing a special issue of the African Journal of Criminology and Justice Studies, with contributions reflecting the importance of some of the things I did in that book. They have also started a journal, Decolonization of Criminology and Justice, at the Auckland University of Technology, and they actually invited me to launch that journal. I'm on the editorial board. So finally, I think the reason why the neo-colonial regimes retain colonial laws is simply what Lord Acton said, that power corrupts, and we may have to add, PowerPoints corrupt absolutely. So that's why I'm keeping my PowerPoint short. In Glasgow, where we are being hosted today, there was a campaign to look at the buildings in Glasgow to see whether they had connections to slavery. And I think the title of that campaign was "It Wasn't Us," a Scottish Glaswegian accent that I don't really have command of. It wasn't us is a way to respond to the crimes of colonialism and slavery by pleading innocence among present generations of people. But history teaches us that universities in Scotland, including the University of Edinburgh and the University of Glasgow and others in England, must have benefited from the exploitation of Africans during the 400 years of slavery and another 100 years of colonization. I think the University of Glasgow has shown a good example by offering $10 million to the University of the West Indies as a form of reparative justice. This is actually the word they use, the phrase they use, reparative justice, which comes from my work. I did coin that phrase, reparative justice, to describe the demand for reparations by people of African descent. So those of us listening today can look at our own institutions to see how we benefited from slavery and colonialism and go beyond the declaration required by the Modern Slavery Act of 2015 in the UK that says every university should say we oppose modern slavery and we will not give contracts to companies that use slave labor. Well, think about the actual cases of centuries of slavery from which your universities benefited and try to offer something back as reparative justice. I think Glasgow set a good example, except they gave all the reparative justice to the University of the West Indies. They should give some to African universities too, because Africans also suffered incredibly from the slave rate and the kidnapping and transportation of millions of Africans for hundreds of years to be enslaved. Thank you.
I would just like to express thanks on behalf of the Centre and on behalf of all of our audience today to you for bringing your work to us and to engaging in this discussion as well. I think in all the universities in the Centre, this is an ongoing discussion. So having you come to talk to us about what decolonization can mean in theoretical terms, in methodological terms, in practical terms has been really very useful. So if we could put our virtual hands together again to say thank you very much to Biko Agozino.
Thank you all. Thank you.
you.